On the day of my daughter's wedding, I pulled up to the security gates of the luxurious estate I had paid for, only to find my own face staring back at me. It was a laminated photo held by a trembling security guard. Across my face, written in bold red letters, were the words, "Severe dementia. Prone to violent outbursts. Do not let him in." It was signed by my own daughter. I did not yell. I did not beg. I simply took out my phone, snapped a picture, and quietly put my car in reverse. 4 hours later, she realized her perfect day had just turned into a crime scene. I am Richard, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my own family inflicted. As a successful commercial real estate developer in Chicago, I thought I had secured our future, but I learned the hard way that sometimes the most dangerous predators live right under your own roof. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up with nothing taught me the value of a single dollar. I spent 40 years of my life building a commercial real estate empire from the ground up. There were early mornings, sleepless nights, and ruthless negotiations. When my beautiful wife Evelyn passed away a decade ago, my entire world narrowed down to our only daughter, Madison. She became the absolute center of my universe. I gave her everything. I paid for private schools, luxury apartments, and designer clothes. I wanted her to have the comfortable life that Evelyn and I had to fight so fiercely to achieve. So when Madison came to me 6 months ago, flashing a massive diamond ring and asking for $300,000 to fund her absolute dream wedding, I did not hesitate. Her fiancé, Logan, was a slick, fast-talking finance manager who always wore custom suits that cost more than my first car. I never quite liked the cold, calculated look in his eyes. He always seemed to be evaluating the net worth of everyone in the room rather than getting to know them as human beings. But Madison loved him, or at least she loved the image of wealth and success he projected to her friends. That was all that mattered to me. I just wanted my little girl to be happy on her special day. I wrote the check that very afternoon, wrapping my arms around her and telling her how proud I was. The wedding day arrived crisp and clear. It was a beautiful Saturday evening in Chicago, the kind of evening that felt full of promise. I stood in my bedroom and put on my custom-tailored tuxedo. I adjusted my bow tie in the mirror, looking at my reflection. I saw a 70-year-old man with silver hair and a proud, genuine smile ready to give his only daughter away. I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I remembered holding Madison as a baby, promising Evelyn I would always protect her. I felt I had finally fulfilled that promise. I left my penthouse and drove my car toward the exclusive, sprawling estate in the suburbs. It was the most expensive venue in the state, a majestic property with perfectly manicured gardens, towering oak trees, and a grand ballroom. During the drive, I could picture the crystal chandeliers and the lavish floral arrangements I had paid for. I imagined the classical string quartet playing softly in the background as guests arrived. My heart was full of joy. I pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gates of the estate, fully expecting the security detail to wave me right through. After all, my name was on the master contract. I was the father of the bride. I was the man who funded this entire grand affair. I rolled down my window and smiled at the young security guard approaching my car. But the young man did not smile back. He looked pale, almost terrified. He held a clipboard tight against his chest and glanced nervously from my face to a piece of paper attached to it. He swallowed hard before stepping closer. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly in the cool evening air. "I am Richard," I said warmly, leaning out the window. "I am the father of the bride. Madison is my daughter. I am here to walk her down the aisle." The guard swallowed hard again. He took a step back, gripping his clipboard even tighter, his knuckles turning white. "I am so sorry, sir, but I have strict orders not to let you inside the property tonight." I frowned, a deep confusion clouding my mind. I thought it was a simple administrative error. "There must be some mistake," I told him gently. "I paid for this venue. My name is on the contract. Please check your guest list again. The guard shook his head slowly, his eyes wide with anxiety. He unclipped a laminated piece of paper from his board and held it up to my window. My breath caught in my throat. It was a high-resolution photograph of my face. Stamped across my forehead in thick, aggressive red ink were those damning words. Severe dementia. Prone to violent outbursts. Do not let him in under any circumstances. At the bottom of the page, written in neat, elegant cursive, was a signature I had seen 1,000 times. Madison's signature. My own flesh and blood. The daughter I had sacrificed everything for had just branded me a violent, incompetent old man to keep me out of the very event I had funded with my own hard-earned money. The words severe dementia echoed in my head. Dementia. My mind was sharper than men half my age. I managed a portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars every single day. The accusation was not just an insult, it was a tactical legal maneuver. If people believed I had dementia, I would lose control of my assets. The young guard watched me closely, clearly waiting for the violent outburst the paper warned him about. He fully expected me to scream, to honk my horn, to throw a massive tantrum like a confused, broken old fool. He braced himself, ready to call for backup. But you do not build a real estate empire by losing your temper when you are cornered. You build it by assessing the threat and crushing it with absolute precision. I felt a chilling calmness wash over me. The loving father inside me died in that exact moment, instantly replaced by the ruthless businessman who had conquered Chicago. I did not say a single word. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and took a clear, high-definition photograph of the laminated sign. I looked the guard dead in the eye, gave him a polite nod, put my car in reverse, and drove away into the night. My daughter thought that by closing those iron gates, she had successfully discarded an annoying old man. She thought she had won. But as I drove back to the city, my mind began piecing together the subtle clues from the past month. The strange requests for my signature on obscure documents. Logan's sudden interest in my estate planning. Madison's insistence that my old business partners were not modern enough for her guest list and should not be invited. The wedding was not a celebration of love. It was a calculated, deliberate trap. And they had absolutely no idea who they were truly messing with. The tires of my sedan hummed a steady rhythm against the asphalt as I merged onto the highway, leaving the estate behind in my rearview mirror. The silence inside my car was deafening. Minutes ago, I was a proud father wearing a custom tuxedo, preparing to walk my only daughter down the aisle. Now I was legally declared mentally incompetent, exiled from my family, by a piece of cardboard and a trembling security guard. I did not press my foot hard on the gas pedal. I did not pound my fists against the steering wheel. Panic is for amateurs, and I had not survived 40 years in the cutthroat world of Chicago commercial real estate by losing my composure when blindsided. Instead, my analytical mind went to work. I forced myself to strip away the emotional shock of a broken heart and began clinically processing the data. I started piecing together the anomalies of the past 6 months. The warning signs had been there all along, flashing in plain sight, but my blind love for Madison had acted as the perfect smokescreen. As the skyscrapers of the city came into view, my thoughts drifted back to a crisp Tuesday afternoon earlier this year. Madison had marched into my penthouse living room, her eyes sparkling with rehearsed excitement, practically dragging her fiancé Logan by the hand. He always looked as though he had stepped out of a luxury magazine. 35 years old, his dark hair slicked back with gel, wearing a tailored navy suit that cost more than a used car. Logan managed a boutique investment fund, or so he proudly claimed, speaking in a rapid-fire sequence of financial buzzwords that sounded too rehearsed to be genuine. I never trusted the rigid, calculated smile he wore. It was the smile of a predator, a man who measured his worth by the designer label on his watch, rather than the substance of his character. But Madison was captivated by his charm. That afternoon, they sat close together on my velvet sofa, and handed me a heavy prospectus for what they called the wedding of the century. It was an extravagant multi-day affair, complete with imported floral arches, a celebrity chef menu, and a guest list that mirrored a high society charity gala. The final price tag was a staggering $300,000. Logan had confidently offered to handle all vendor payments directly through his wealth management firm. He claimed it would maximize the tax benefits of the event and save us from endless administrative headaches. I looked deeply into my daughter's eyes, saw the desperate hope reflecting back at me, and reached for my gold fountain pen. I wrote that massive check directly to Logan's firm without a second thought. I genuinely believed I was buying her a lifetime of secure happiness. The deeper I drove into the sleeping city, the clearer the sinister nature of their manipulation became. I vividly remembered an unsettling conversation from just 4 weeks ago. I had been sitting at my large oak desk reviewing a list of my oldest, most trusted business partners. These were the men who had stood loyally by my side during the hardest years of building my company. I wanted to invite them to celebrate this monumental family milestone. Madison had walked into the study, her face contorted with a patronizing look of concern. She knelt gracefully beside my chair, placing her soft hands over mine. "Dad," she had said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "this is going to be a highly curated modern influencer wedding. We have professional photographers and digital media partners covering the entire aesthetic of the evening. Your old business friends are wonderful people, but they are going to feel completely out of place. They will just ruin the modern vibe we are meticulously going for. Besides, you have been looking so tired lately. A massive 3-day event will be exhausting for you at your age. Why do you not just stay home, relax, and rest? We will do a private dinner, just the 3 of us, right after we get back from the honeymoon." At the time, I had felt a sharp, humiliating sting of rejection deep in my chest. But I foolishly rationalized it. I told myself she was just an anxious bride stressed by the crushing pressure of hosting a public event. I swallowed my wounded pride, nodded with a forced smile, and told her I understood. I agreed to stay out of the way. I agreed to let her shine without my burdensome presence. I was an absolute fool. She was not protecting me from exhaustion. She was systematically isolating me from the public eye. I pulled my sedan into the secure underground parking garage of my downtown residential building, the tires squeaking against the polished concrete floor. The private elevator ride up to the penthouse felt like an agonizing eternity. When the silver doors slid open, I stepped into my dark and utterly quiet home. The sprawling view of the Chicago skyline twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, providing a mocking contrast to the absolute betrayal festering like poison inside my chest. I did not bother turning on the main overhead lights. I walked straight down the long, shadowed corridor toward my private home office. My heavy leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the imported hardwood floor, echoing in the emptiness. If Logan and Madison had carefully orchestrated my legal exclusion from the wedding under the guise of severe mental decline, the $300,000 check I had written was the undeniable anchor point of their entire deceptive operation. I needed to see the physical paper trail immediately. I needed to know exactly what corporate account that money had been funneled into, and more importantly, I needed to understand exactly how they had established the legal authority to claim to security personnel that I was suffering from severe dementia. I stepped into the home office, flicked on the brass desk lamp, and grabbed my keys. I unlocked the heavy mahogany drawer where I kept all my sensitive personal and financial records. My hands moved with rapid precision as I sifted through the neatly organized folders. I immediately found the file labeled with Madison's name. Inside, tucked perfectly into a clear plastic sleeve, was the bank receipt confirming the transfer of the $300,000 directly to Logan's wealth management firm. That part of the transaction was entirely legitimate. But as my fingers brushed against the bottom of the drawer, a profound chill swept over my entire body. The velvet-bound master checkbook that I kept for emergency liquid capital was missing. A deep sense of dread washed over me. I quickly turned my attention to the fireproof steel safe embedded in the wall behind my oak bookshelf. My fingers flew across the metal dial as I spun the combination. I gripped the handle, pulled the heavy steel door open, and reached inside for the thick red folio. That specific folio contained my complete estate planning documents, my finalized last will and testament, my irrevocable asset trusts, and my medical directives. My hand met empty air. The folio was completely gone. My hand hovered in the cool air inside the steel vault. The red folio containing my life's work was gone. It held the trusts securing Madison's future. It held my power of attorney and healthcare directives. My mind raced. A thief breaks into a safe to steal cash or jewelry. Someone who steals legal estate documents is aiming for the entire kingdom. I slowly closed the heavy steel door and locked it tight. I took a deep breath, forcing the rising panic back down into my chest. Emotion is the enemy of strategy. I needed facts. I needed data. I needed to trace the money. I sat at my mahogany desk. I booted up my secure desktop computer. The screen flickered to life. I placed my smartphone face down on the desk. My hands were steady. The betrayal left behind a cold, clinical focus. I opened my encrypted banking portal. Years ago, I opened a joint account to help Madison manage her living expenses. I kept it open for major milestones. I used it to deposit $300,000 for her wedding recently. I logged in and waited for the dashboard. I expected a single wire transfer to a legitimate vendor, a catering company or the venue itself. The dashboard materialized on my screen. I clicked into the transaction history for the joint account and filtered the search for the last 90 days. The screen populated with a long, dense list of outgoing transfers. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the columns. There was no single wire transfer for $300,000. Instead, the balance had been systematically bled dry. Starting 3 days after I deposited the funds, a continuous stream of transfers had begun. Each transfer was for exactly $9,000. They occurred every morning at exactly 8:15. $9,000 on Monday. $9,000 on Tuesday. $9,000 on Wednesday. The pattern continued relentlessly until the entire balance was completely drained. I stared at the numbers, recognizing the tactic immediately. It is a well-known financial maneuver called structuring. Criminals and fraudsters use it to keep transactions under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold, intentionally bypassing automated alerts from the Internal Revenue Service and bank fraud departments. My son-in-law, a man who claimed to manage legitimate funds, was moving my money like a common launderer. I shifted my gaze to the recipient column. Every single one of those $9,000 transfers had been routed to the exact destination. An external account listed under the name Apex Ventures Limited Liability Company. I had never heard of Apex Ventures. It was not a catering company. It was not a floral designer. It was certainly not the luxury estate where the wedding was taking place. I opened a new tab on my browser and navigated directly to the Illinois Secretary of State Business Database. If you want to hide in the shadows of the corporate world, you do not register your illicit shell companies in your home state. But arrogant men always make foolish mistakes. They believe they are the smartest in the room. I typed the name Apex Ventures into the corporate search bar and pressed enter. The database churned for a second before pulling up the official registration documents. My eyes locked onto the screen, scanning the fine print. The company had been incorporated a mere 4 days before I wrote that $300,000 check. It was a completely empty shell holding no physical address other than a generic post office box in downtown Chicago. I scrolled down to the section listing the corporate officers and the registered agent. There, printed in stark black letters on the official state document, was the name Logan Hayes, my son-in-law. The man currently standing at an altar, pretending to marry my daughter in a celebration funded by my generosity. He was the sole proprietor of Apex Ventures. The reality of the situation crashed over me with absolute clarity. They had not just excluded me from a family celebration. They had not just decided my presence was an embarrassing inconvenience. They had deliberately and systematically stolen my money. The wedding was merely the plausible excuse they needed to separate me from $300,000 in liquid cash. But the theft of the cash was only a secondary concern now. The stolen legal documents were the true threat. If Logan was bold enough to embezzle cash using a traceable shell company, what was he planning to do with my medical directives and my durable power of attorney? I sat back in my chair and stared at the glowing monitor. The silence of the penthouse felt heavier now. It was no longer just an empty home. It was a staging ground for my own destruction. Madison knew. She had to know. My beautiful daughter, the girl I had raised with every ounce of love and devotion I possessed, was an active participant in this fraud. She had looked me directly in the eyes, smiled her radiant smile, and lied to my face. She had taken my money, stripped me of my dignity, at the front gate of that estate, and allowed her husband to raid my private safe. The severity of the betrayal felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. For a brief, agonizing moment, the father inside me wanted to pick up the phone, call her, and beg for an explanation. I wanted to hear her say it was all a terrible misunderstanding. I wanted to believe that Logan had manipulated her, that she was an innocent victim in his financial schemes. But the ruthless businessman inside me knew better. You do not forge medical documents and steal estate folios by accident. You do it with absolute calculated intent. I closed the browser tab containing the business registry and opened a new secure window. I needed to protect the rest of my assets immediately before Logan could leverage my stolen documents to access my primary holdings. I initiated a complete lockdown on my personal banking accounts. I suspended every single credit card attached to my name. I revoked the authorization on the joint account entirely, ensuring not a single penny could ever be withdrawn again. Every digital gateway to my wealth was now securely sealed, but I knew that freezing my liquid accounts was only a temporary measure. If Logan truly had my power of attorney and a forged medical declaration of incompetence, he could theoretically walk into any bank branch in the city and override my digital commands. He could legally claim that my attempts to freeze the accounts were the paranoid actions of a man suffering from severe dementia. I needed legal reinforcement. I needed an offensive strategy. I reached for my phone, ready to make the calls that would initiate a devastating war against my flesh and blood. They thought I was an old, weak fool. They thought I would simply vanish into the shadows and die quietly. But they had profoundly underestimated the terrifying resolve of a betrayed father who has absolutely nothing left to lose in this world. I picked up my smartphone, my fingers moving with absolute mechanical precision over the cold glass screen. I did not dial my only daughter. I did not call the wedding venue to scream at the security guards or demand entry. I bypassed every emotional impulse of a heartbroken father and went straight for the heavy artillery. I scrolled through my encrypted contacts and pressed the name Garrison. Garrison was not just a standard private investigator. He was a former federal agent who had spent the last 15 years operating in the gray areas of corporate espionage and financial tracking. He was the exact man I called when a rival real estate developer tried to bury me in fabricated zoning lawsuits, or when a contractor attempted to embezzle construction funds. He answered on the second ring. His voice was low, sharp, and entirely alert, instantly recognizing the unusual late hour of my call. I did not bother with any pleasantries or explanations. I gave him a single sharp directive. I told him I needed a comprehensive forensic trace on a shell company named Apex Ventures registered right here in the state of Illinois. I told him the registered agent was Logan Hayes, my new son-in-law. I heard the sharp, sudden intake of breath on the other end of the line. Garrison knew Logan. He knew Madison. He knew my family dynamics, and he knew exactly what this kind of investigation meant. I instructed him to tear into every financial record, every offshore routing number, every hidden wire transfer, and every associate tied to that corporate entity. I told him I did not care what privacy walls he had to breach or how much money it would ultimately cost. I gave him exactly 60 minutes to deliver a preliminary dossier directly to my secure server. Garrison simply said it would be done immediately, and the line went dead. The investigative machinery was now fully in motion. Without wasting a single second, I immediately dialed Victor. Victor was my lead corporate attorney, a brilliant, highly meticulous man who had expertly structured my entire commercial real estate empire over the past 2 decades. He was the masterful architect of my family trusts and the strict guardian of my legal fortresses. He answered the phone with a cheerful, vibrant tone, likely assuming I was calling from the wedding reception to share a celebratory toast or a moment of joy. His jovial greeting felt like a physical blow to my chest, a stark, painful reminder of the joyous evening I was supposed to be experiencing with my only child. I cut him off immediately before he could finish his congratulations. My voice was completely devoid of emotion, cold and hollow, as I issued the command. Freeze everything. I told him to completely lock down every single corporate account, every holding company, every real estate portfolio, and every personal trust currently under my name. Victor stammered, his cheerful demeanor vanishing instantly, clearly bewildered by the sudden, drastic nature of the order. He frantically asked me if I was in physical danger, if the firm was under a sudden hostile takeover attempt from a corporate rival. I told him the hostile takeover was coming directly from inside my own family. I calmly explained that my master checkbook was gone, my private wall safe had been raided, and my entire estate planning folio was completely missing from my home. I told him that Logan and Madison had intentionally locked me out of the wedding using a falsified medical document aggressively claiming I had severe dementia. The silence on Victor's end of the line was absolute and terrifying. For a man who made his highly lucrative living through constant negotiation and rapid verbal maneuvering, he was completely, utterly speechless. When he finally found his voice, it was thick with a very real, very raw professional panic. He instructed me to stay on the line and not hang up while he logged directly into the secure county clerk database. I paced the length of my home office, listening to the frantic, rhythmic clacking of his keyboard coming through the speaker of my phone. The sound was like a ticking clock counting down the final seconds to my financial execution. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glowing, vibrant grid of the downtown Chicago streets. I had built massive buildings down there. I had literally shaped the skyline of this city with my own bare hands and relentless ambition. And now, a 35-year-old fraudster in a tailored suit was actively trying to steal it all, while drinking expensive champagne at a lavish party I had personally paid for. The rapid clacking on the phone suddenly stopped. It was not a gradual slowing down of keystrokes. It was an abrupt, horrifying halt that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I heard Victor let out a long, ragged, shaky exhale. His breathing sounded entirely wrong. It was the desperate sound of a man who had just watched a massive ship sink beneath the ocean waves. "Richard." Victor whispered, his voice cracking with a profound level of dread I had never once heard from him before. He did not call me Mr. or boss as he usually did. He used my first name. I asked him exactly what he saw on the glowing screen. He told me that exactly 3 weeks ago, a highly specific document had been expedited through the county court system. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. It granted absolute, unquestionable legal control over my entire commercial estate, my sensitive healthcare decisions, and my vast financial portfolios. It systematically stripped me of my autonomy and legally transferred the master keys to my entire kingdom to a designated proxy. I asked him who the proxy was, even though the bitter, toxic truth was already burning like acid in my stomach. Victor confirmed my absolute worst fear. The legally registered proxy was Logan. My son-in-law had quietly filed the powerful document using a specialized, expedited legal service intentionally bypassing our usual corporate legal channels entirely. I asked Victor how this massive breach was even remotely possible without my physical presence, my signature, and my explicit consent. He explained with a trembling voice that the legal document was accompanied by a sworn, notarized medical affidavit signed by a licensed psychiatric specialist. The fraudulent affidavit legally declared me mentally incompetent, explicitly citing rapid onset dementia and a complete irreversible inability to manage my own affairs. They had legally erased me. Logan did not just have my money, he had my life. The room began to spin, but I forced my feet to remain firmly planted on the floor. I gripped the edge of my desk until my knuckles turned completely white. This was no longer a simple case of a greedy son-in-law siphoning a wedding fund. This was a highly orchestrated, malicious coup designed to strip me of everything I had spent my entire lifetime building. I took a deep breath, steadied my nerves, and prepared to declare absolute war on my own flesh and blood. Exactly 32 minutes after my phone call, the private elevator chimed. The heavy oak doors of my penthouse slid open to reveal Victor and Garrison. Neither man spoke a word of greeting. They did not offer hollow sympathies or ask how I was feeling. They knew me well enough to understand that tonight was not about comfort. It was about raw retaliation. Victor walked straight into my study, his face pale and drawn, clutching a thick manila envelope against his chest, as if it were a live grenade. Garrison followed behind, his posture rigid and his eyes scanning the room with the practiced vigilance of a former federal agent. Garrison closed the double doors to the study and locked them. The sharp click of the deadbolt echoed like a gunshot in the room. I remained seated behind my desk, my hands resting flat on the cool leather surface. Victor approached the desk and laid the envelope down. He did not open it immediately. He looked at me with a mixture of profound professional dread and deep personal sorrow. He drafted the original blueprints of my corporate empire. Seeing it hijacked by a 35-year-old fraudster was an insult to his life's work as much as it was to mine. I told him to open the envelope. I did not want soft landings or sugar-coated explanations. I demanded the unfiltered truth. Victor nodded slowly. He untwisted the string tie of the envelope and slid a stack of crisp, legally stamped documents onto my desk. The top page bore the official seal of the Cook County clerk. It was the durable power of attorney he had warned me about on the phone. But seeing it in physical form, holding the heavy watermarked paper in my own hands, made the betrayal infinitely more real. I read the first paragraph. The legal jargon was dense and complex, but the core message was horrifyingly clear. This document completely stripped me of every legal, financial, and medical right I possessed as a human being. It granted total, unquestionable authority over my vast real estate portfolio, my private bank accounts, and my personal healthcare decisions to Logan Hayes. I looked up at Victor. I asked him how a document with such devastating power could be legally binding without my presence in a courtroom or a law office. I had never met the notary whose signature stamped the bottom of the page. I had certainly never signed away my life's work to the slick, manipulative boy who slept next to my daughter. Victor let out a long, ragged sigh. He pulled a second document from the stack and slid it across the smooth wood of the desk. This, he explained softly, is how they bypassed you completely. I looked down at the second document. It was not printed on county letterhead. It was printed on the official stationery of a private high-end psychiatric clinic located in the wealthiest district of the city. I did not recognize the name of the clinic or the name of the chief medical officer printed at the top. The document was a sworn medical affidavit. I began to read the clinical language. The words blurred together for a fraction of a second before my brain forced them into sharp focus. The doctor claimed to have evaluated me extensively over the past 4 months. The affidavit stated that I was suffering from severe Alzheimer's disease. It detailed fabricated incidents of extreme memory loss, violent outbursts, and a complete inability to comprehend basic financial concepts. The doctor officially declared me a profound danger to myself and an absolute liability to my corporate holdings. He legally certified that I was incompetent to manage my own affairs. I stared at the forged medical evaluation. A sudden chilling wave of realization washed over me. Logan had not simply filed a fake piece of paper. He had purchased a corrupt medical professional. He had spent an enormous sum of money to buy a fabricated diagnosis from a licensed psychiatrist willing to risk his entire medical career for a massive payout. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was a sophisticated, meticulously planned conspiracy designed to erase me from society. I handed the medical affidavit to Garrison. The private investigator scanned the document, his jaw clenching tight. He looked at me and stated that this specific doctor had a long, shadowy history of providing favorable evaluations for wealthy clients involved in bitter corporate succession battles. Garrison promised me he would have a team tearing into the doctor's offshore bank accounts by morning. He assured me we would find the massive bribe Logan had undoubtedly paid him. But right now, the financial bribe was secondary to the sheer psychological cruelty of the act. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Chicago skyline. The pieces of the puzzle were finally snapping together with terrifying precision. The bizarre requests from Madison over the last few months suddenly made perfect sense. She had intentionally isolated me from my business partners. She had convinced me to stay home from corporate galas and charity events, claiming I looked exhausted and needed to rest. She was meticulously building a false narrative. She was carefully setting the stage so that when this forged medical document was finally filed, my sudden absence from public life would perfectly align with the story of a tragic, rapid cognitive decline. She had actively helped her husband paint me as a broken, dying old man. And then the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. I thought about the young, terrified security guard standing at the front gate of the wedding venue just hours ago. I remembered the laminated photograph of my face. I recalled the bold red letters warning the staff about my severe dementia and my supposed violent tendencies. The profound cruelty of that sign had initially blinded me to its true tactical purpose. I looked at Victor and Garrison, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. I explained what had happened at the gate. I told them about the sign Madison had signed. The realization hit the three of us simultaneously. The flyer at the gate was not just a malicious insult designed to humiliate me. It was an absolute tactical necessity for their survival. If I had walked into that lavish reception wearing a custom tuxedo, looking sharp, lucid, and completely in control of my faculties, I would have instantly destroyed the elaborate narrative they had built. The wealthy guests inside that venue needed to believe I was locked away in a memory care facility. My presence at the wedding would have proven my sanity to everyone in attendance. They banned me from the venue because a mentally incompetent billionaire cannot show up to a party and hold a coherent conversation. They locked me out to protect their lie. My daughter sacrificed my dignity to protect a criminal enterprise. I felt a cold, ruthless energy replace the final traces of my paternal sorrow. The trap was fully illuminated. The time for grief was over. The time for destruction had officially begun. Garrison did not waste a moment allowing the gravity of the medical forgery to settle in the room. He turned his attention back to his encrypted laptop, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the practiced speed of a seasoned federal agent. If Logan and Madison were willing to fabricate a severe dementia diagnosis to seize my entire estate, the $300,000 wedding was undoubtedly a critical piece of their broader operational architecture. I stood behind Garrison, watching lines of code and secure database portals flash across his screen. I told him to pull the direct vendor manifests from the suburban estate, where the event was actively taking place. As the primary financier of the venue rental, my name was still deeply embedded in the preliminary booking agreements, giving Garrison the digital foothold he needed to bypass their standard privacy protocols. He accessed the master event schedule for the evening and began reading through the finalized logistics. The deeper he dug into the operational details of the night, the more the illusion of my daughter's dream wedding completely unraveled before my eyes. The first glaring anomaly was the distinct lack of traditional wedding vendors. A $300,000 luxury wedding requires a small army of specialized contractors. It requires florists, decorators, a dedicated bridal party coordinator, a high-end photographer, and extensive musical entertainment. Garrison opened the finalized delivery logs for the estate. There was no record of a florist delivering imported floral arches or centerpieces. There was no entry for a wedding cake delivery. There was no jazz band or string quartet contracted for the evening. The only vendors registered and cleared through the security gates were a premium corporate catering company, a specialized audio-visual team equipped with high-definition projection screens, and a fleet of private valets. It did not look like the logistical footprint of a romantic marital celebration. It looked exactly like the corporate setup for an executive conference. My mind raced back to the detailed prospectus Madison and Logan had handed me in my living room months ago. Every single detail in that heavy, glossy binder had been a complete fabrication. They had used the concept of a lavish wedding as the perfect, unquestionable excuse to extract a massive sum of liquid capital from my accounts without triggering my immediate suspicion. But the true scale of their deception did not become fully apparent until Garrison breached the digital guest registry. A normal wedding guest list is a predictable mix of extended family members, childhood friends, and close personal acquaintances. I leaned over Garrison's shoulder as the alphabetical list of 300 confirmed attendees populated on the bright screen. I scanned the names, my heart sinking with every row I read. I did not recognize a single friend of Madison's from her university days. I did not see the names of any extended relatives on my late wife's side of the family. Instead, I saw a meticulously curated roster of Chicago's most powerful and elusive financial figures. There were prominent venture capitalists, aggressive hedge fund managers, commercial real estate developers, and high-net-worth angel investors. These were the apex predators of the Midwestern financial district. These were men and women who did not attend social weddings unless there was a highly lucrative networking opportunity or a direct financial incentive involved. Garrison highlighted a cluster of names on the screen, pointing out that several of the attendees were managing directors of institutional investment firms. The profound sickness in my stomach rapidly evolved into a sharp, terrifying clarity. Madison and Logan had not thrown a wedding. There was no exchanging of vows. There was no romantic first dance or tossing of a bridal bouquet. They had organized an incredibly exclusive, highly sophisticated capital-raising gala. They had leveraged the prestigious reputation of the suburban estate and the guise of a high-society social event to lure 300 wealthy investors into a single room. And they had funded the entire fraudulent operation using my stolen money. The narrative they had carefully constructed suddenly made perfect malicious sense. They needed a compelling reason to gather Chicago's financial elite under one roof without alerting the standard regulatory watchdogs. A lavish wedding reception provided the ultimate cover for a massive, unregulated investment pitch. But to execute a financial maneuver of that magnitude, Logan needed an underlying asset to legitimize his pitch. He needed a guarantee that would make the investors open their checkbooks without hesitation. And that was exactly why they had to completely eliminate me from the equation. I stepped back from the desk, running a hand over my face, as the full, devastating architecture of their scheme locked into place. Logan was a mid-level fund manager with a reputation that was more flash than actual substance. He did not possess the personal capital or the established industry track record to command a room full of 300 institutional investors. But I did. My name carried 40 years of unblemished commercial real estate success. My portfolio was renowned for its stability and massive generational wealth. By forging the durable power of attorney and fabricating the medical affidavit declaring me mentally incompetent, Logan had legally positioned himself as the sole custodian of my entire empire. He was using the gala to announce his sudden, tragic assumption of my throne. He was standing on that stage right now, playing the role of the dutiful, grieving son-in-law stepping up to manage the family business because his poor father-in-law had lost his mind to dementia. He was using my stolen assets, my stolen reputation, and my forced absence to pitch a fraudulent investment fund to a room full of billionaires. The sheer audacity of their crime was breathtaking. Madison had stood in my living room and looked me in the eye, pretending to be a stressed bride, all while actively helping her husband orchestrate a massive financial fraud built entirely on the fabricated destruction of my cognitive health. She had placed that flyer at the security gate not out of spite, but out of absolute necessity. If I had walked into that estate coherent, articulate, and completely sane, I would have instantly shattered the foundational lie of their entire pitch. The investors would have seen that Richard was not a broken man suffering from violent dementia. They would have realized that Logan was a fraud. My daughter had banned me from the venue to protect her husband's elaborate criminal enterprise. She had coldly traded her father's dignity, freedom, and legacy to fund her own luxurious delusions. I looked at Victor, who was staring at the guest list with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Victor understood the legal and financial ramifications immediately. If Logan successfully secured capital from these investors using my forged power of attorney and my stolen real estate portfolio as collateral, my entire empire would be hopelessly entangled in a massive web of federal wire fraud. I would be legally bound to debts and promises I had never made. Garrison closed the laptop screen, his face hardening into a grim mask of determination. We knew the truth. We knew absolutely everything. We knew the truth. We knew absolutely everything. But knowing the surface of a betrayal is never enough for a man who has spent his entire life building an empire from the ground up. I needed to understand the foundational mechanics of their desperation. People do not forge medical documents and steal corporate portfolios just to throw a lavish party. They do it because they are drowning and need a lifeline. I instructed Garrison to dig deeper into the origins of Apex Ventures. I wanted to know where Logan came from before he walked into my living room with his tailored suits and his rehearsed financial jargon. Garrison nodded and turned his attention back to his glowing laptop screen. His fingers danced across the keyboard with rapid precision as he bypassed standard security protocols and accessed restricted financial databases. He isolated Logan's primary wealth management firm and began tracing the historical cash flows. The silence in my penthouse was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the keys. Victor stood by the window nervously checking his phone while I remained perfectly still behind my desk. 10 minutes passed in complete silence before Garrison finally stopped typing. He let out a long breath and looked up at me. His expression was grim, the look of a man who had just uncovered a mass grave. He turned the laptop screen toward me so I could see the digital wreckage for myself. Logan did not manage a successful boutique investment fund. That entire persona was a meticulously crafted illusion. Up until 6 months ago, Logan had been running a highly aggressive cryptocurrency hedge fund. He had leveraged the volatile digital market to attract millions of dollars from high-net-worth individuals, promising them impossible returns. For a short while, the market favored him, and he lived like a king. He bought expensive cars, wore designer clothing, and showered my daughter with luxury gifts. But cryptocurrency is a ruthless master. When the market violently crashed 6 months ago, Logan's entire fund collapsed overnight. He lost everything. But the true horror was not just the loss of the initial capital. To keep his extravagant lifestyle afloat and hide the initial losses from his investors, Logan had secretly transitioned his failing fund into a classic Ponzi scheme. He had started using money from new investors to pay off the old ones, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of profitability. When the crash hit, the music stopped completely. The new money dried up instantly, and the old investors came looking for their guaranteed returns. Garrison pointed to a specific ledger on the screen. Logan was currently $12 million in debt, and he did not owe this money to standard corporate banks or forgiving institutional lenders. He owed $12 million to very dangerous, very unforgiving people. The guest list at the estate tonight was not just a collection of wealthy venture capitalists. It included representatives of aggressive private equity firms and shadowy syndicates who did not take kindly to losing their money. These were people who would completely destroy a man for losing that kind of capital. Logan was a dead man walking. The walls had been closing in on him, and he needed a massive, immediate bailout to save his own life. That was exactly when he looked across the dinner table and saw his wealthy, unsuspecting father-in-law. I was the perfect target. I had the exact amount of liquid capital and hard assets required to instantly erase a $12 million deficit. The entire wedding was nothing more than a desperately staged theatrical production to save Logan from his own catastrophic failures. He had lured his angry creditors to that suburban estate tonight, under the guise of an exclusive celebration. But they were not there to eat premium catering or celebrate a marriage. They were there to hear a desperate pitch. Garrison opened a newly intercepted email thread from Logan's private server. It contained a comprehensive presentation deck titled The Vanguard Real Estate Initiative. Logan was currently standing in front of those dangerous men, pitching a brand new, highly lucrative commercial real estate fund. He was promising them exclusive access to a massive portfolio of prime downtown properties. My properties. He was using my life work as the foundational collateral to secure new investments and pay off his $12 million debt. And to prove he had the legal authority to leverage those buildings, he was showing them the forged, durable power of attorney. He was explaining that his beloved father-in-law had tragically succumbed to severe dementia, forcing Logan to step up and take control of the family empire. The forged psychiatric evaluation was the ultimate proof of his absolute authority. It was a brilliantly evil maneuver. By the time I could ever prove my sanity in a court of law, Logan would have already liquidated my assets, paid off his dangerous creditors, and vanished completely, leaving me with nothing but empty bank accounts. The sheer audacity of the scheme was staggering, but it was the realization of my daughter's involvement that truly broke the last remaining piece of my heart. Madison was not a naive victim caught in the crossfire of her husband's financial crimes. She was an active, willing participant. 6 months ago, right when Logan's crypto fund completely imploded, was exactly when her behavior toward me began to change. That was when she started suggesting I looked too tired to attend board meetings. That was when she began laying the groundwork for my sudden medical exile. She knew her husband owed $12 million to dangerous people. She knew they were about to lose their luxury cars, their designer clothes, and their elite social status. And when faced with the prospect of losing her lavish lifestyle, my daughter had made a cold, calculated decision. She chose the illusion of wealth over her own father. She willingly signed off on my total destruction. She smiled in my face, kissed my cheek, and helped her husband forge the documents that would legally erase me from existence. She traded my dignity, my freedom, and my 40 years of hard work just to keep up appearances. She stood at the gates of that estate tonight, wearing a dress paid for by my money, and instructed the guards to turn me away like a trespasser. She did it to ensure I would not interrupt the presentation that was actively dismantling my empire. I closed my eyes, letting the profound weight of her betrayal settle into my bones. I had worked to give her everything she could ever desire. I built a fortress of wealth to ensure she never knew a day of struggle. In return, she invited a predator into my fortress and handed him the keys to the vault. I opened my eyes. The paternal sorrow that had been threatening to paralyze me was completely gone. It was consumed by a cold, calculating fury. I was no longer a grieving father mourning the loss of his daughter. I was a ruthless businessman whose empire was under attack. I looked at Garrison and Victor. The time for gathering information was over. We knew the truth. We knew absolutely everything. I stood up from my heavy leather chair and walked around the mahogany desk, my eyes locked on the glowing screen of Garrison's laptop. I leaned in and focused on the digital copy of the fraudulent investment prospectus that Logan was currently projecting to a room full of dangerous billionaires. My gaze did not linger on the fabricated financial projections or the stolen real estate assets he was using as illegal collateral. Instead, my eyes drifted down to the bottom of the title page, resting on the printed location of this grand, deceptive gala. It was an opulent, sprawling property located in the wealthy northern suburbs, renowned for its manicured gardens, imported marble architecture, and absolute impenetrable exclusivity. It was the kind of venue that commanded astronomical rental fees and required a waiting list of at least 2 years. Logan had undoubtedly chosen this specific estate to project an aura of unassailable wealth and stability to his angry creditors. He needed the physical environment to reflect the billionaire status he was falsely claiming to have inherited from my family. He wanted to stand on the most expensive stage in the entire state of Illinois to deliver his desperate life-saving pitch. But Logan was a man who lived entirely on the surface. He understood the visual power of a designer suit and a luxury brand, but he fundamentally lacked the required intellectual discipline to fully understand the deep, complex roots of commercial real estate. He saw a beautiful venue and booked it. He never bothered to trace the intricate web of corporate ownership that operated silently beneath the estate's polished surface. If he had possessed the foresight to pull the county property records, he would have discovered that the estate was owned and operated by a holding company called Horizon Properties. And if he had dug just one layer deeper into the corporate registry of Horizon Properties, he would have discovered a fact that would have turned his blood to solid ice. Horizon Properties was a subsidiary shell. I personally owned 80% of it. A slow, incredibly cold smile spread completely across my face. It was the first time I had smiled since I watched my daughter lie to me in my own living room months ago. The sheer magnificent irony of the situation was almost intoxicating. Logan Hayes was currently standing on a stage, desperately trying to steal my entire corporate empire, completely unaware that he was standing inside a building that belonged to me. He had locked me out of the front gates of my own property. The security guards who had humiliated me and turned me away were technically on my payroll. My own son-in-law was not a brilliant financial mastermind executing a flawless coup. He was a cornered, panicked rat who had blindly scurried directly into my own custom-built cage. I turned to Garrison and asked him for the direct private cellular number of the general manager of the estate. Garrison tapped his keyboard, navigating the secure corporate directory, and recited the number aloud. I pulled my personal smartphone from my jacket pocket and dialed. The phone rang 3 times before a crisp, highly professional voice answered, identifying himself as Marcus Vance, the executive director of hospitality for the estate. He politely informed me that the venue was currently hosting a private high-security event and asked how he could direct my call. I did not raise my voice once. I spoke with the calm, terrifying authority of a man who held the absolute power to dismantle a person's career with a single word. I told him my name. I told him my exact position within Horizon Properties, and I recited the private corporate identification code that only the primary shareholders possessed. I heard the sharp, sudden intake of breath on the other end of the line as Marcus realized exactly who was speaking to him. The polite, rehearsed hospitality tone vanished instantly, replaced by the rigid, alert cadence of a man speaking to his ultimate employer. I did not give him any time to offer fake pleasantries or apologize for the earlier incident at the front gate. The guards had simply followed the fraudulent instructions they were given. My anger was not directed at the staff. It was entirely reserved for the architect of the fraud. I issued a series of rapid, non-negotiable directives. First, I ordered Marcus to immediately and quietly lock down the main entrance gates. No vehicles were to enter, and more importantly, no vehicles were to leave the property under any circumstances. Second, I instructed him to go directly to the grand ballroom, where the presentation was currently taking place, and discreetly unlock the 2 private VIP side doors located behind the main stage. Those specific doors were designed for high-profile guests to enter and exit without passing through the main crowd. Finally, I told him to pull his entire security detail back to the perimeter and wait for my physical arrival outside. I explicitly commanded him not to alert the host of the event whatsoever. Marcus Vance confirmed every single order with absolute, unquestioning obedience. The estate was now entirely under my tactical control. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The physical environment was secured. The trap was set. Now I needed the appropriate firepower to bring the entire criminal enterprise crashing down. I turned my attention to Victor, my corporate attorney, who was watching me with wide, completely astonished eyes. He had witnessed my transition from a grieving, betrayed father into a ruthless, calculating apex predator, and the shift had clearly unnerved him. But Victor was a professional, and he knew how to execute orders in the heat of a corporate war. I walked back to my mahogany desk and looked Victor dead in the eyes. I reminded him that Logan was not just pitching a bad investment. He was actively committing massive, coordinated federal wire fraud. He was using forged legal documents to leverage interstate commercial real estate assets, and he was doing it to actively cover up the collapse of an unregulated cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme. That specific combination of severe financial crimes fell completely outside the jurisdiction of local police departments. It was the exact, highly specialized hunting ground of the federal government. I told Victor to pick up his phone and immediately contact his highest-level associates within the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Victor had spent 20 years navigating the complex legal landscapes of Chicago. He possessed a vast, deeply cultivated network of powerful federal prosecutors and senior investigative agents. I instructed him to rapidly forward the entire digital dossier Garrison had just compiled directly to his most aggressive federal contact. I wanted the forged durable power of attorney, the bribed psychiatric medical evaluation, the offshore banking transfers, and the $12 million debt ledger sent over secure channels immediately. Victor nodded quickly, unlocking his tablet to initiate the secure transfer. The pieces were finally set. It was time to introduce myself to the investors and reclaim my stolen kingdom. The drive back to the northern suburbs felt entirely different from my journey earlier that afternoon. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, bleeding streaks of orange and deep purple across the vast Midwestern sky. The dark interior of the luxury sedan was completely silent. Garrison was behind the wheel, his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. Victor sat beside me in the back seat, occasionally glancing at his phone as he coordinated with his federal contacts. I stared out the tinted window, watching the familiar landscape blur past my vision. Hours ago, I had traveled this exact route as a proud, unsuspecting father wearing a custom tuxedo and carrying a heart full of absolute joy. I had been ready to give away my only daughter. Now I was returning as a highly calculated predator, returning to reclaim my stolen empire and deliver a devastating reckoning. The vehicle exited the main highway and turned onto the winding tree-lined road leading toward the sprawling estate. I instructed Garrison not to approach the heavily guarded main entrance. I had no intention of facing that trembling security guard again or validating the fraudulent flyer bearing my face. Instead, we navigated down a discreet, unmarked utility road that cut directly through the dense surrounding forest. This was a private access route specifically designed for heavy catering trucks, discreet vendor deliveries, and the absolute privacy of the primary property owners. It was a road that Logan, in his superficial rush to book the most expensive venue in the state, had no idea even existed. The thick canopy of oak trees blocked out the fading sunlight, plunging the sedan into deep shadow as we approached the rear perimeter of the property. The heavy iron service gates loomed ahead, completely devoid of the flashing lights or bustling valet attendants that occupied the front entrance. As we pulled up to the service entrance, the imposing iron gates silently glided open. Marcus Vance, the executive director of hospitality, stood waiting in the shadows. He was dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit, his posture rigid, and his hands clasped firmly behind his back. He did not look like a man hosting a joyous wedding. He looked like a soldier awaiting a direct command from a superior officer. Garrison parked the sedan near the loading dock, and the three of us stepped out into the cool evening air. Marcus immediately stepped forward, his eyes darting quickly toward Victor and then settling on me. He offered a brief, incredibly respectful nod. He did not offer any unnecessary apologies for the earlier incident at the front gate, which I quietly appreciated. He simply stated that the facility was entirely locked down according to my exact specifications. The valet team had secured all guest vehicles, and the perimeter security detail had been pulled back from the main ballroom area to ensure our entrance remained completely undetected. I thanked him for his rapid compliance. He gestured toward a set of heavy reinforced steel double doors designated strictly for VIP access and discreet logistical operations. He scanned his personalized access badge, and the magnetic locks disengaged with a heavy, satisfying click. I stepped across the threshold, leaving the cool evening breeze behind, and entered the hidden labyrinthine corridors of my own property. The stark contrast between the bright, festive atmosphere I knew was happening in the main ballroom and the dim, utilitarian silence of these service hallways was striking. We were moving through the unseen veins of the estate, completely invisible to the 300 wealthy investors, drinking premium champagne just a few hundred feet away. Just inside the service corridor, waiting silently in the dim fluorescent light, were 3 men. They wore sharp, nondescript dark suits that lacked any visible branding or flair. Their postures were completely relaxed, yet their eyes missed absolutely nothing. They were the senior investigative agents from the White-Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, personally summoned by Victor just an hour prior. They did not flash their badges or offer dramatic introductions. Their presence alone carried a heavy, undeniable weight of ultimate federal authority. The lead agent, a tall man with graying temples and a sharp jawline, stepped forward and introduced himself quietly as Agent Miller. He confirmed that Victor had successfully transmitted the entire digital dossier containing the forged durable power of attorney, the bribed psychiatric evaluation, and the extensive financial ledgers detailing Logan's massive cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme. Miller stated that the evidence was more than sufficient to establish probable cause for massive interstate wire fraud and criminal forgery. He informed me that they were officially taking operational jurisdiction of the premises. I nodded, acknowledging his authority, but I made one single unyielding request. I told Agent Miller that I needed to be the first person to walk through those ballroom doors. I needed Logan and Madison to look directly into the eyes of the man they had attempted to erase before the federal handcuffs were placed on their wrists. Miller studied my face for a long second, recognizing the absolute immovable resolve of a betrayed father, and gave a slow, silent nod of agreement. We began our final march through the opulent, shadowed corridors of the mansion. I walked at the front of the formation, flanked by Victor on my left, and the 3 federal agents trailing closely behind. The thick, heavily woven imported carpets perfectly absorbed the sound of our measured footsteps, rendering our steady approach toward the final destination completely silent. We moved past the industrial kitchens where the catering staff was preparing appetizers, completely oblivious to the raid unfolding beside them. We efficiently navigated a complex series of narrow service staircases and opulent marble-lined hallways, decorated with exquisite antique tapestries and rare paintings. My heart beat with a steady thud against my ribs. There was no fear left in my blood. There was absolutely no hesitation or lingering paternal sorrow remaining. The emotional shock had burned away, leaving a clinical focus. I was a man operating at the absolute peak of my analytical faculties, entirely ready to surgically dismantle a massive fraudulent empire built completely on the back of my own stolen identity. As we finally drew closer to the grand ballroom, the muffled, ambient sounds of a massive gathering began to slowly filter through the thick walls. I could hear the low murmur of 300 venture capitalists networking, the clinking of glassware, and the soft background music. We stopped outside the heavy VIP doors situated behind the main stage. I stood perfectly still in the shadows, listening intently. Suddenly, the ambient noise in the ballroom quieted down. A sharp, confident voice echoed through the high-end audio system, projecting clearly into the corridor. It was Logan speaking. His tone was perfectly modulated, radiating false sincerity and rehearsed corporate grief. He was welcoming the distinguished guests, thanking them for their presence on such a difficult day, and preparing to introduce the Vanguard Real Estate Initiative. He was preparing to sell my life to these absolute strangers. I reached out, took a deep breath, and wrapped my hands tightly around the cold brass handles of the double doors. I pushed down on the cold brass handles, and the heavy double doors glided open with a silent, oiled grace. The sudden rush of air conditioning carried the scent of expensive cologne roasted tenderloin and the undeniable electric hum of concentrated wealth. I stepped through the threshold, leaving Victor and the federal agents waiting in the darkened hallway behind me. I moved quietly into the shadows of the elevated viewing balcony that wrapped around the upper perimeter of the grand ballroom. The vantage point was absolutely perfect. I stood partially concealed behind a massive fluted marble pillar, my hands gripping the intricately carved wooden railing. I looked down at the sprawling scene unfolding below me. The room was a sea of black tuxedos and glittering evening gowns. 300 of the most ruthless and powerful financial figures in the Midwest were seated at round tables covered in crisp white linens and crystal centerpieces. The waitstaff moved silently through the crowd, pouring expensive champagne into delicate flutes. But no one was paying attention to the food or the drink. Every single face in that massive room was turned toward the brightly illuminated stage set up at the far end of the ballroom. The enormous digital projection screen behind the podium bathed the audience in a stark blue light. There, standing center stage under the harsh glare of the theatrical spotlights, was Logan. He wore a midnight blue velvet tuxedo that fit him with tailored perfection. He held a cordless microphone in his right hand, pacing back and forth across the stage with the practiced predatory rhythm of an evangelical preacher selling salvation. Even from my elevated position in the shadows, I could see the distinct sheen of nervous sweat glistening on his forehead. He was slick, polished, and oozing a desperate, aggressive charm. He clicked a small remote in his left hand, and the massive screen behind him shifted to a high-definition aerial photograph of a towering downtown commercial complex. It was my flagship property, the very first skyscraper I had ever financed and built from the ground up. The building represented 40 years of my blood, sweat, and relentless sacrifice. Now, it was being reduced to a flashy visual aid in a desperate attempt to cover up a catastrophic cryptocurrency collapse. Logan gestured broadly toward the screen, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. He spoke with a rehearsed rhythmic cadence, throwing out aggressive financial buzzwords and promising astronomical quarterly yields that no legitimate real estate fund could ever sustain. He was selling them an absolute illusion. The tone of his voice suddenly shifted. The aggressive high-energy sales pitch slowed down, dropping into a register of somber, practiced reverence. Logan stopped pacing and walked to the center of the stage, lowering his head slightly. He told the silent room that tonight was a celebration of future prosperity, but it was also a night of profound personal transition for his family. He took a deep theatrical breath and spoke the words that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. As many of you know, he said, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom, my father-in-law is a legend in this city. He built an empire that has defined the Chicago skyline for decades. But time is a cruel master. With his rapidly declining health and his tragic severe cognitive deterioration over the past several months, he has officially stepped down from public life. He has legally entrusted me to take the helm. He has handed me the keys to the kingdom, to lead his magnificent empire into the future. Tonight, we honor his legacy as we officially open the doors to the Vanguard Real Estate Initiative. A low, sympathetic murmur rippled through the crowd of wealthy investors. They were buying every single word of his sickening performance. They believed they were witnessing a respectful transfer of generational power. But the absolute worst part of the spectacle was not Logan's desperate, fraudulent pitch. The true nightmare was standing just a few feet away from him on that brilliantly lit stage. Madison, my beautiful, cherished daughter, was standing next to the podium, wearing a breathtaking pearl-encrusted designer gown that must have cost tens of thousands of dollars. She looked like a tragic, graceful queen. As Logan delivered his sickening monologue about my supposed dementia and mental collapse, Madison reached out and gently placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. She looked out at the audience, her face arranged in a perfect mask of quiet, brave sorrow. She nodded sympathetically as her husband lied to 300 people about the destruction of my mind. She was actively validating the forgery. She was selling the narrative of my demise to secure her own financial salvation. I watched her perform her role with absolute flawless precision, and the last fragile cord of paternal hope snapped permanently inside my chest. She was not a victim. She was the co-author of my execution. She had traded the father who loved her for a velvet tuxedo, a designer gown, and the desperate hope of bailing out a drowning criminal. The sheer magnitude of her callousness was almost impossible to fully comprehend. I stood in the darkness of the balcony, my grip tightening on the wooden railing until my knuckles burned with sharp pain. I watched Logan click to the next slide, revealing a detailed spreadsheet of my personal liquid assets, falsely rebranded as the seed capital for his new fraudulent venture. He was explicitly inviting the sharks in the room to feast on my lifetime of hard work. He asked the audience to raise their glasses in a toast to my legacy, urging them to invest their capital tonight and join him in building the future. 300 crystal flutes rose into the air, catching the light in a dazzling display of wealth and deception. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I simply stood in the shadows, letting the cold reality of their absolute betrayal crystallize my resolve. I had seen everything I needed to see. The play was over. The actors had delivered their lines, and the audience was fully captivated by the tragic story. It was finally time to change the script. It was time for the dead man to walk out onto the stage and speak for himself. I turned my back to the ballroom and walked quietly toward the dark stairwell, leading directly down to the main floor. The heavy silence of the hidden corridors perfectly matched the cold calculation taking over my mind. Every step I took down those marble stairs was a deliberate march toward a permanent, devastating resolution. They had orchestrated this elaborate, expensive fiction to completely erase my authority and steal my legacy. Now I was going to use their own grand stage to completely obliterate their future. I reached the ground level and paused for one final second in front of the heavy velvet curtains separating the service hallway from the brilliantly illuminated ballroom. I adjusted my tie, smoothed the lapels of my custom tuxedo, and stepped out from the shadows into the blinding light. I emerged from the elevated service corridor onto the landing of the grand marble staircase sweeping down into the main ballroom. The blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers washed over my vision. I stood at the top of the stairs, a silent, immovable figure, looking down upon the sea of powerful investors. At my prearranged signal, Marcus reached out from the sound booth and cut the ambient background music. The sudden silence in the massive room was deafening. A split second later, the heavy oak entrance doors at the far end of the hall slammed shut with a thunderous boom that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. The metallic clatter of deadbolts engaging sealed the room completely. The abrupt noise startled the crowd. 300 heads turned away from the brightly lit stage and looked toward the back of the room. Their eyes began to trace the source of the disruption, slowly moving upward until they found me standing at the pinnacle of the grand staircase. I did not rush. I placed my polished leather shoe onto the first marble step and began my descent. My posture was rigid, my expression forged from stone. I moved with the deliberate grace of a predator who has cornered its prey. As I descended, a low, confused murmur began to ripple through the sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns. These were men and women who had just been told I was locked away, suffering from violent dementia. Yet here I was, walking toward them, with clarity and undeniable authority. The murmurs grew louder, transforming into a wave of palpable shock. The crowd instinctively parted, creating a clear path down the center of the ballroom floor, allowing me unobstructed access to the stage. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the two figures, standing frozen under the theatrical spotlights. Madison saw me first. The perfect, sympathetic mask she wore melted away, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. Her hands began to tremble violently. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a shattering crack that pierced the tense silence of the room. The liquid splashed across the hem of her designer gown, but she did not look down. She stood paralyzed, staring at the father she had tried to destroy. Logan was entirely motionless. The blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale gray under the harsh stage lights. He looked like a man who had just seen a phantom returning from the grave. The confident, booming voice he had used to sell my stolen empire completely failed him. He stood behind the wooden podium, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. His right hand remained suspended in the air, gripping the microphone like a useless lifeline. I reached the bottom of the grand staircase and stepped onto the main ballroom floor. I walked down the center aisle, passing the bewildered faces of the absolute most elite financial predators. They watched me with wide, searching eyes, their sharp minds frantically trying to reconcile the narrative of a dying, incompetent man with the terrifying reality of the Titan marching through their ranks. I did not acknowledge a single one of them. I reached the base of the stage and walked up the short flight of stairs without breaking my stride. I crossed the stage directly toward Logan. He took a tiny, instinctive step backward, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He was utterly trapped, cornered on the stage he had rented to complete his fraudulent masterpiece. I stepped directly into his personal space, invading the area behind the podium. He smelled of nervous sweat and fear. I reached out and calmly took the microphone directly out of his shaking fingers. He offered no resistance. His entire body was rigid with shock, his mind completely incapable of processing the catastrophic failure of his grand scheme. I turned my back to him, completely dismissing his existence, and faced the massive crowd of investors. I tapped the microphone twice to ensure it was active. The sharp thumps echoed through the silent ballroom. I looked out over the sea of faces, taking a slow, deep breath to steady the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting with a steady, commanding authority that left absolutely no room for doubt or misinterpretation. "I apologize for my slightly delayed arrival to this extraordinary gathering. As you have just been informed by the man cowering behind me, my health has supposedly been a matter of grave concern." I paused, letting the heavy irony of the statement hang in the tense air. I slowly swept my gaze across the room, making direct eye contact with several prominent venture capitalists I had known for over a decade. "I assure you, my mind is exceptionally clear, my memory is completely intact, and my capacity to manage my own affairs has never been sharper." The confused murmurs in the crowd instantly ceased, replaced by a profound, electrified silence. They were highly intelligent people, and they were rapidly beginning to realize they had been invited to a slaughter. I gestured toward the massive digital screen behind me, still displaying the detailed portfolio of my flagship properties. "You have been brought here tonight under the pretense of a highly exclusive investment opportunity." I continued, my voice growing colder and sharper with every word. "You have been promised unprecedented returns and exclusive access to a real estate empire built over 40 years. You were told that I voluntarily stepped down, that I handed over the keys to my kingdom due to a tragic mental decline." I turned slightly, casting a disgusted glance at Madison, who was quietly weeping, and Logan, who looked as though his legs were about to collapse. I turned back to the audience. "Every single word you have heard tonight is an absolute fabricated lie. The man standing on this stage is not a visionary fund manager stepping up to save a family legacy. He is a desperate, drowning fraudster running a collapsed cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme. He is currently $12 million in debt to extremely dangerous individuals. He lured you here tonight to use my stolen assets as illegal collateral to bail himself out of a catastrophic financial ruin." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The atmosphere instantly shifted from confusion to outrage. I raised my free hand, demanding total silence, and the room immediately obeyed. "I am not here to negotiate," I stated firmly. "I am the sole owner of 80% of this estate you are standing in. I am the absolute owner of every property displayed on that screen. I did not sign a durable power of attorney. I did not consent to a medical evaluation. The documents this man holds are criminal forgeries purchased with bribes and executed with the willing, enthusiastic assistance of my own daughter. I looked down at the crowd, my expression devoid of any mercy. The doors to this facility are now locked. Federal agents from the white-collar crime division are standing in the corridors. This presentation is permanently over, and the reckoning has officially begun. The ambient background music was instantly cut by Marcus leaving the heavy oak doors to slam shut with a thunderous boom that sealed the massive room. The crowd murmured in deep confusion as they turned their heads to witness my sudden entrance. I walked deliberately down the grand staircase, my posture rigid, and my expression completely devoid of mercy. Madison saw me first, her perfect facade crumbling into pure terror. She dropped her champagne flute, and the delicate crystal shattered loudly across the polished marble floor. Logan froze completely, the blood rapidly draining from his face as his confident demeanor evaporated. I calmly walked up the short steps of the brightly illuminated stage, approached the podium, and took the microphone right out of his shaking hand. I turned my back to him, facing the bewildered sea of wealthy venture capitalists and powerful billionaires. Thank you all for attending the funeral of my son-in-law's career. The words echoed through the cavernous ballroom, sharp and completely cold. A few gasps erupted from the audience, but no one dared to move or speak out of turn. These were highly intelligent financial predators, and they immediately recognized a monumental shift in absolute power. I looked directly into the camera stationed at the back of the room and gave a subtle, practiced nod. High above us, in the secure sound booth, Garrison immediately hijacked the primary audio-visual feed. The glossy presentation slides detailing the Vanguard Real Estate Initiative vanished from the massive digital screen directly behind me. In their place, a stark black and white document appeared. I pointed to the massive screen projecting the new damning evidence. You are currently looking at the authentic financial ledger for Apex Ventures. This is the highly secretive cryptocurrency hedge fund that Logan Hayes has been aggressively managing for the past 3 turbulent years. As you can clearly see by following the highlighted red columns, Apex Ventures is not a profitable enterprise. It is a catastrophic total failure. 6 months ago, when the digital currency markets experienced a sudden collapse, Logan's entire fund was completely wiped out overnight. He lost every single dollar of his initial capital. But instead of admitting his massive failure and facing the consequences like a man, he chose to double down on deception. He secretly transitioned his bankrupt fund into a textbook Ponzi scheme using the fresh capital from new investors to desperately pay off the older ones. I paused to let the gravity of my words sink into the minds of the men and women seated before me. Logan was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, as the inescapable reality of his situation closed in around him. Madison was sobbing quietly, her face buried in her hands, completely shattered by the public destruction of her false reality. The music stopped. Months ago, I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. The new investments dried up, and the old investors came looking for their guaranteed returns. As of this exact moment, Logan is $12 million in debt. I did not raise my voice, but the intense volume of the silence in the room made every syllable strike like a physical blow. Garrison advanced the slide on the screen, revealing a detailed list of encrypted wire transfers and outstanding debts. He owes this massive sum not to forgiving institutional banks, but to highly dangerous, completely unregulated private syndicates. Several representatives of those exact syndicates are currently seated in this very room tonight. I saw several men in the back rows physically stiffen, their eyes narrowing with sudden, violent realization as they recognized their own compromised investments. This entire gala is nothing more than a desperately staged theatrical production designed to save his own life. He needed a massive, immediate bailout to satisfy his angry creditors. So he looked across his own family dinner table and decided to target my entire corporate empire. Garrison advanced the digital slide once again. This time, the massive screen displayed the forged medical documents alongside the durable power of attorney. You see, I explained calmly, Logan lacked the established industry track record and personal capital to command a room full of prestigious institutional investors. My name carries 40 years of unblemished commercial real estate success. My portfolio is globally renowned for its stability and massive generational wealth. By forging this durable power of attorney and fabricating a psychiatric affidavit declaring me mentally incompetent, Logan legally positioned himself as the sole custodian of my entire empire. He used the guise of a high society social event to gather you all into a single room. He intended to leverage my stolen assets and my stolen reputation to pitch a fraudulent investment fund, securing your capital to pay off his massive $12 million deficit. He was standing on this stage playing the role of the dutiful, grieving son-in-law stepping up to manage the family business because his poor father-in-law had lost his mind to severe dementia. And my daughter, my own flesh and blood, stood right beside him and enthusiastically supported this evil deception. She traded her father's dignity, freedom, and legacy to fund her luxurious delusions and protect a criminal. The sheer audacity of their crime is absolutely breathtaking. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They completely underestimated the man they were attempting to erase from existence. I turned my body slightly, addressing the captive audience of billionaires with a commanding, authoritative stare. If any of you have already signed a commitment letter tonight, I strongly suggest you locate it immediately. If you have written a check, tear it up. If you have initiated a wire transfer, cancel it the moment you walk out of these doors. Any capital invested in the Vanguard Real Estate Initiative will instantly vanish into the black hole of Logan's existing debts. You are not buying into a lucrative future. You are throwing your wealth into a burning, sinking ship. The sheer panic in the room was now palpable. Venture capitalists were quickly reaching into their tailored jackets, retrieving their signed agreements, and ripping them into tiny pieces. Others were frantically typing on their smartphones, desperately attempting to halt pending digital transactions. Logan fell to his knees on the stage, completely paralyzed by the utter devastation of his carefully constructed illusion. His breathing was ragged, his face buried in his trembling hands. Madison fell to the floor beside him, her beautiful designer gown pooling around her on the cold stage. She reached out to me, her voice breaking into a hysterical, pleading wail. I looked down at her with absolutely zero compassion. Her tears were not born of genuine remorse, but of pure terror, because the illusion of her wealthy lifestyle had just been violently shattered. I turned my back on her desperate, pathetic pleas. I looked toward the velvet curtains at the back of the room and gave a single nod. The curtains parted, and Victor stepped into the brilliant light, followed closely by Agent Miller and a squad of armed federal agents. The absolute finality of the moment settled over the crowd as the federal handcuffs were locked around Logan's violently shaking wrists. The initial shock that held the room captive suddenly fractured, shattering into an explosion of absolute uncontainable chaos. 300 of the most powerful and ruthless financial predators in the Midwest erupted simultaneously. The polite murmurs of high society vanished, instantly replaced by the raw, aggressive shouting of billionaires who had just realized they were standing on the precipice of a massive financial slaughter. Chairs were forcefully shoved backward, screeching loudly against the polished marble floor as men in custom tuxedos surged toward the stage. They demanded their signed commitment letters. They shouted for their attorneys. They yelled for immediate corporate accountability, their faces flushed with righteous, predatory fury. The elegant illusion of my daughter's dream wedding had officially collapsed into a vicious mob of enraged creditors. Logan stood frozen behind the podium for only a fraction of a second longer before his primal survival instincts finally kicked in. He saw the furious investors advancing from the front and the grim faces of the federal agents closing in. Despite the heavy steel handcuffs already secured tightly around his violently shaking wrists, the desperate reality of a lengthy federal prison sentence flashed across his panicked eyes. With a sudden violent burst of adrenaline, Logan forcefully jerked his bound arms, breaking the initial loose grip of the arresting officers. He shoved his shoulder forward, sending the heavy wooden podium crashing down onto the stage floor, and made a desperate sprinting dash toward the private VIP exit on the far right side of the grand ballroom. He moved with the frantic, uncoordinated speed of a cornered animal, his expensive midnight blue velvet tuxedo jacket flapping wildly behind him. But he was a soft corporate fraudster trying to outmaneuver seasoned federal law enforcement in a room with absolutely no viable exits. Agent Miller did not even blink. He issued a sharp single command, and the three plainclothes agents positioned seamlessly within the crowd immediately converged on the fleeing groom. They moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. Before Logan could even reach the first set of marble steps leading to the service corridor, two massive agents intercepted his path. They did not gently apprehend him. They hit him with the full devastating force of federal authority. Logan was violently tackled, his body lifted inches off the ground before being slammed brutally against the ornate wood-paneled wall of the ballroom. The heavy thud of his impact echoed above the shouting crowd. The wind was completely knocked out of his lungs, leaving him gasping for air like a dying fish. One agent aggressively pinned Logan's face against the expensive wallpaper, while the other wrenched his arms painfully behind his back. The cold, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists cut through the air with absolute unforgiving finality. Agent Miller calmly walked across the stage, pulling a printed federal warrant from his jacket pocket. He leaned in close to Logan's ear, his voice projecting a lethal calmness, and formally read him his rights, citing massive federal wire fraud, interstate corporate extortion, and severe criminal forgery. The glamorous, untouchable facade that Logan had so carefully constructed was completely obliterated in a matter of seconds. He was no longer a visionary venture capitalist, securing millions in seed funding. He was a broken, weeping criminal pinned against a wall, facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Watching her husband's spectacular, violent downfall, Madison finally broke. The perfect, sympathetic mask she had worn to deceive the crowd shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that genuinely chilled the blood in my veins. She collapsed entirely, her knees hitting the hard wooden stage with a sickening thud. The breathtaking pearl-encrusted designer gown that she had purchased using my stolen money pooled around her like a deflated parachute. She crawled across the floor of the stage, ignoring the sharp splinters and the spilled champagne, dragging herself frantically toward my polished leather shoes. She reached out with trembling, manicured hands and grabbed the fabric of my tuxedo pants. Her grip was desperately tight, her knuckles turning completely white as she clung to me like a drowning woman grasping at a life raft. She looked up at me, her flawless, expensive makeup completely ruined by a torrential flood of dark, heavy tears. Her chest heaved with violent, uncontrollable sobs as she looked into my eyes, searching desperately for the loving, forgiving father she had so callously discarded just hours prior. "Dad, please!" she wailed, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched shriek that echoed terribly over the angry shouts of the surrounding investors. "Please, you have to stop them. Tell them it is a mistake. He is my husband. You cannot let them take him away. I did not know it was this bad. I swear to you, I did not know." She shook my leg violently, her tears staining the dark fabric of my trousers. She was begging for a miraculous rescue, begging for the protective paternal shield that I had unconditionally provided for her entire life. She was using the exact same tone, the exact same pleading eyes she had used as a little girl when she had broken a vase and wanted me to fix it. But we were not in her childhood home, and she had not broken a simple piece of pottery. She had attempted to completely destroy my life, my mind, and my legacy. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping, pathetic creature clinging to my legs. I did not reach down to comfort her. I did not place a reassuring hand on her trembling shoulder. I simply stared at her with an expression of absolute freezing detachment. The father she was crying out for no longer existed. That man had died the moment she handed a forged psychiatric evaluation to a corrupt doctor and banned me from my own property. I calmly reached down and firmly detached her gripping fingers from my clothing, pulling her hands away one by one. I stepped back, severing all physical contact. "You knew exactly what this was," I said, my voice dropping to a low, unforgiving whisper that only she could hear over the surrounding chaos. "You stood in my living room and watched him plot my execution. You knew about his massive debts, you knew about the forged documents, and you actively placed that flyer at the security gate to ensure I would be locked out of my own life. You completely traded away your soul for a velvet dress and a stolen lifestyle." I slowly looked past her weeping form, watching the federal agents forcefully march Logan toward the private service doors. He was dragging his feet, his head hanging in total defeat, as the harsh reality of his ruined future finally consumed his mind. I looked back down at Madison, who was still kneeling on the stage, completely abandoned, and now utterly alone. "You chose your husband and his criminal ambitions over your own father," I told her, turning my back on her for the absolute final time. "Now you will have to stand here and watch his empire burn to ash, and you get to burn alongside him." The silence that followed my words was heavier than anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. Madison remained on the floor of the grand stage, her hands still clutching the fabric of my trousers, unwilling to accept the absolute finality of my statement. Her desperate sobbing echoed through the massive ballroom, a pathetic soundtrack to the destruction of her carefully curated illusion. She looked up at me with eyes completely bloodshot and wide with panic, searching for a single trace of the loving father who had spent 40 years shielding her from the harsh realities of the world. She expected me to break. She expected the paternal instinct to override my logic, to reach down, lift her up, and magically fix the catastrophic wreckage she and her husband had created. But the man she was looking for had been systematically murdered by her own greed. I looked down at her tear-stained face, feeling an overwhelming emptiness where my unconditional love used to reside. There was no pity left in my heart, only a cold, clinical understanding of the predator she had chosen to become. She had viewed my affection as a weakness, a vulnerability to be exploited for designer gowns and elite social status. She sobbed louder, her manicured nails digging deeper into the dark fabric of my suit, begging me to reconsider, begging me to use my influence to stop the federal agents who were currently pinning her fraudulent husband against the far wall of the stage. She pleaded with me to remember our family, to remember the bond we shared, completely ignoring the fact that she had been the one to entirely sever that bond when she signed her name to a fabricated medical document declaring me insane. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show a single ounce of anger. The fury had entirely burned away, leaving behind a terrifying, absolute calm. I slowly bent my knees and lowered myself until my face was only inches from hers. The sudden proximity caused her to freeze her breath, catching in her throat as she anticipated a momentary reprieve. I looked directly into her frightened, desperate eyes, making sure she could see the complete void of emotion in my own. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision, ensuring that my voice cut through the ambient noise of the room and landed directly in her ear. Before I delivered the final blow, time seemed to slow down to a crawl. As I stared into her weeping, ruined face, my mind violently pulled me back to a freezing December morning, 22 years ago. Evelyn was in the final stages of her battle with cancer, confined to a hospice bed in our old house. Madison was just 10 years old, a tiny, fragile thing with pigtails and a missing front tooth. I remembered holding Madison's small, trembling hand as we stood by Evelyn's bedside. My dying wife had looked at me with eyes hollowed out by pain and made me swear a sacred oath. "Protect her, Richard," Evelyn had whispered, her voice barely a rasp. "Give her the world. Don't let her feel the coldness of this life." I had wept that day. I had sworn on my own soul that I would build a fortress so high and so strong that no harm, no scarcity, and no sorrow could ever touch our daughter. I spent the next 2 decades honoring that promise with a blind, fanatical devotion. I worked 80-hour weeks. I crushed my competitors. I missed holidays and birthdays, trading my own peace of mind to amass a fortune so vast it could secure our bloodline for 5 generations. Every drop of sweat, every ruthless negotiation, every gray hair on my head was for the little girl weeping at my feet right now. And how did she repay that sacred vow? By weaponizing the very fortress I built to protect her, turning it into a prison designed to erase me. I looked at the imported pearl-encrusted fabric of her dress. I recognized the designer. It was a custom piece from Milan, easily costing upwards of $40,000. I had paid for it. I had paid for the flawless veneer on her teeth, the diamond studs in her ears, and the elite university education that she had ultimately used to mastermind my execution. The stark contrast between the innocent child I had promised to protect and the absolute parasite kneeling before me was so jarring, it made my stomach turn. I did not let her look away. I grabbed her chin, my grip firm and entirely devoid of paternal gentleness, forcing her to maintain eye contact. "Do you know when my heart truly broke, Madison?" I asked, my voice a lethal low frequency that only she could hear over the screaming crowd and the scuffle of federal agents hauling her husband away. It was not when I saw the fake medical evaluation. It was not when I realized Logan was a pathetic con artist. It was when Garrison cracked your private encrypted messaging app. Madison's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. The tears momentarily stopped, frozen by the sudden realization that I possessed every single dark secret she had tried to bury. "I read your text messages, sweetheart," I whispered, the endearment dripping with pure venom. "I read the exact conversation you had with Logan 3 weeks ago while I was sitting in the next room drinking the tea you made for me. He was panicking about the county clerk rejecting the initial power of attorney draft. And you, my beautiful, sweet daughter, you texted him back saying, 'Just bribe the doctor to up the dosage on the fake charts. The old man is so blindly in love with me he won't even notice if we lock him in a home by Tuesday.'" I watched the color completely drain from her neck and face. She began to hyperventilate, shaking her head in a pathetic, rhythmic denial, but she had absolutely no words to defend herself. "You orchestrated the entire narrative of my mental decline," I continued, slicing through her silence like a scalpel. "You were the one who fired my longtime housekeeper, Maria, claiming she was stealing just so you could control my environment and intercept my corporate mail. You were the one who convinced my board of directors that I was suffering from severe fatigue. You meticulously isolated me piece by piece, day by day, setting the stage for my legal murder. You didn't just stand by while Logan committed fraud. You handed him the murder weapon and pointed him directly at my head." She let out a choked, guttural sob, her hands flying up to grasp my wrists, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. "Dad, please, he made me do it. Logan manipulated me. He said we were going to lose everything. He threatened me," she hissed desperately, trying to play the ultimate victim card. It was the final pathetic refuge of a cornered narcissist. In the background, I could hear the humiliating sounds of Logan crying as the FBI agents forcefully emptied his pockets, tossing his expensive gold watch and designer wallet onto a nearby table as evidence. The man who had stood on this stage minutes ago, projecting an aura of untouchable wealth, was now blubbering like a terrified child. Madison didn't even look at him. Her entire universe had shrunk down to the terrifying realization that her personal ATM had just permanently closed its vault. I let go of her chin and forcefully peeled her hands off my wrists, tossing them aside as if they were infected. "Do not insult my intelligence," I sneered. "I saw the offshore bank routing numbers. I saw the Cayman Island holding company registered exclusively in your maiden name. You were not a victim, Madison. You were the chief financial officer of your own father's assassination. You did it because you could not fathom the idea of downgrading from a $10 million penthouse. You did it because your addiction to status, to private jets, and to the envy of your shallow friends meant more to you than the life of the man who gave you everything. I leaned in even closer, letting the sheer freezing reality of her new existence wash over her. Take a good look around this room, Madison. Look at the crystal. Look at the marble. Breathe in the scent of this luxury. Because this is the absolute last time you will ever experience it. By tomorrow morning, your black cards will be declined. The biometric locks on your penthouse have already been permanently altered by my security team. The massive trust fund I set up for you when you were born has been entirely liquidated and legally dissolved as of an hour ago. You have absolutely nothing. No money, no status, no husband, and no father. You are going to have to walk out of this majestic estate tonight in that $40,000 gown and figure out how to survive in the real world with zero marketable skills and a reputation as a federal co-conspirator. The sheer brutality of the truth finally shattered whatever fragile psychological defense she had left. She did not just cry. She began to mourn for herself in a way that was almost grotesque to witness. She curled into a fetal position on the hard stage, her arms wrapped around her stomach, wailing into the polished wood. The billionaires in the front row, men who had known me for decades and had watched Madison grow up, observed in stunned, uncomfortable silence as the former princess of Chicago high society writhed on the floor like a beggar. "I'm your daughter," she screamed into the floorboards, a desperate, broken mantra. "I'm all you have left of Mom. You can't do this to Mom's memory." Hearing her invoke Evelyn's name was the final catalyst. Any lingering ghost of hesitation inside me was instantly incinerated by a white-hot, purifying rage. "Do not dare speak her name!" I commanded, my voice cracking like a whip so sharp that it made a nearby federal agent flinch. "Your mother was a woman of honor, of loyalty, and of profound grace. If she were alive, to see the parasite you have become, to see you trading my dignity to cover the debts of a cowardly fraudster, she would have locked those iron gates on you herself." I stood up to my full height, towering over her broken, weeping form. The physical distance between us felt like a massive, unbridgeable chasm. She was no longer my child. She was merely an obstacle I had successfully neutralized. I looked down at her one last time, feeling the absolute weight of a 22-year illusion finally lifting off my shoulders. "You signed a legal paper stating that I had absolutely no memory." "Madison," I whispered, my voice completely devoid of any warmth. "You stood before a corrupt physician and swore that my mind was completely gone, that I could no longer recognize my own family or manage my own affairs. You built your entire criminal foundation on the premise that I was a broken, forgetful old man." I paused, letting the crushing weight of her own actions press down upon her chest. "Well, you are half right. Starting right now, at this exact moment, I have completely forgotten I ever had a daughter." The words struck her with the devastating force of a physical blow. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as the true magnitude of her loss finally registered in her mind. She realized in that singular, terrifying second that there was no coming back from this. There would be no forgiveness, no future reconciliations, no generous allowances to maintain her luxurious lifestyle. She was entirely cut off, cast out of the fortress I had built, left to navigate the wreckage of her own choices, without a single penny of my wealth to protect her. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands suddenly going completely limp and falling away from my legs. She slumped forward onto the cold marble floor of the stage, her spirit utterly broken by the absolute finality of my rejection. I stood up slowly, straightening my posture and adjusting the cuffs of my tuxedo jacket. I did not spare her another glance. I completely severed my emotional attachment to the woman weeping at my feet, permanently closing the door on that chapter of my existence. I turned my back to her and faced the grand ballroom. The 300 wealthy investors who had been lured to this fraudulent gala remained completely frozen in their seats, watching the dramatic conclusion of this high-stakes tragedy in stunned silence. As I began to walk away from the center of the stage, the sharp, authoritative voice of Agent Miller cut clearly through the tense atmosphere. He was standing over Logan, hauling the defeated fraudster to his feet by the collar of his expensive velvet jacket. I walked past them with measured, deliberate steps as the federal agent formally read Logan his Miranda rights. "You have the right to remain silent," Miller stated, his voice echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." The standard legal phrasing served as the perfect fitting soundtrack to my departure. Logan did not struggle. He hung his head in total defeat. His shoulders slumped as the heavy steel handcuffs clinked softly against his wrists. He had attempted to steal an empire, and his ultimate reward would be decades in a federal penitentiary. I stepped down from the elevated stage and walked back onto the main floor of the ballroom. The sea of prominent venture capitalists and powerful hedge fund managers instinctively parted before me, creating a wide, unobstructed path toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. They looked at me with a profound mixture of awe and absolute terror. They had witnessed a masterclass in corporate survival. They had seen a titan reclaim his throne with surgical precision and ruthless execution. No one offered a single word of protest or attempted to block my exit. They simply stepped aside and watched. I reached the double doors at the far end of the grand hall. Victor was waiting for me there, standing alongside two federal agents. Victor gave me a respectful nod, his eyes reflecting deep reverence for the man he had served for over 2 decades. He reached forward and pushed the massive oak doors open, allowing the cool evening air to sweep into the stifling, tension-filled ballroom. I stepped across the threshold and walked out into the dimly lit service corridor, leaving the chaos, the weeping, and the shattered illusions completely behind me. The heavy doors swung shut with a solid thud, sealing Logan and Madison inside the beautiful, expensive cage they had rented for their own execution. I walked down the quiet marble hallway, with Victor by my side, our footsteps echoing softly in the empty space. The burden of betrayal that had been sitting on my chest for the past several hours was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, undeniable sense of absolute clarity and profound strength. Garrison was waiting for us at the end of the corridor, standing patiently next to the luxury sedan. The empire was secure. I was stepping back into the brutal, unforgiving arena of global finance with a renewed, terrifying focus. My reign was far from over. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom closed on the illusion of my daughter's wedding. The federal justice system moves with a notoriously slow and agonizing pace, but when you hand them a perfectly documented case of massive wire fraud and a neatly wrapped cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme, the gears turn with astonishing speed. The fallout from that night was absolute and catastrophic for the architects of my attempted demise. Logan did not even try to fight the charges in a courtroom. Once Agent Miller and his team successfully breached the offshore servers and matched the $12 million debt ledger to the forged medical documents, his high-priced defense attorneys advised him to surrender immediately. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of federal wire fraud, interstate corporate extortion, and aggravated identity theft. 2 weeks ago, a federal judge in downtown Chicago sentenced him to 15 years in a maximum security penitentiary. There will be no early parole for good behavior, no leniency for his white-collar status. The dangerous creditors he tried to defraud using my stolen assets are currently under severe federal investigation, themselves dismantling the shadowy syndicate he relied upon. He will spend the next decade and a half locked in a concrete cell, permanently stripped of his tailored velvet tuxedos and his arrogant charm, completely ruined by his own insatiable greed. Madison did not fare much better. When the federal authorities seized Logan's fraudulent holding companies, they also froze every single joint bank account, investment portfolio, and real estate asset remotely tied to his name. The luxurious penthouse they shared overlooking the gorgeous city skyline was immediately repossessed by the federal government to begin restitution for his defrauded clients. She was evicted with only the clothes she could quickly carry in a single suitcase. I made absolutely certain she had nowhere soft to land. The very next morning after the gala, I sat down with Victor and Garrison to systematically liquidate every single trust fund, emergency savings account, and premium credit line she previously had access to. I legally and completely severed her from my wealth. She had stubbornly assumed that my paternal love would eventually override my logic, that I would eventually send a massive check to bail her out of the miserable poverty she created. She was completely wrong. My daughter now lives in a tiny, cramped apartment on the far industrial outskirts of the city. To pay her rent, she works 40 grueling hours a week at a minimum wage retail job in a busy shopping mall. She spends her days standing on her feet, folding clothes and dealing with difficult customers, a harsh, unforgiving contrast to the pampered elite lifestyle she felt so deeply entitled to. Every Tuesday, without fail, a handwritten letter arrives at my corporate office. The envelopes are always addressed in her familiar looping handwriting. She is begging for a second chance, begging for a simple conversation, begging for a tiny fraction of the luxurious life she threw away. I do not open them. I do not read a single word of her desperate apologies. I take those sealed envelopes and feed them directly into the industrial shredder beneath my heavy mahogany desk. The woman who cold-bloodedly plotted to declare me legally insane and steal my commercial empire does not deserve my valuable time, my forgiveness, or my pity. She made a permanent, malicious choice, and now she is living the permanent, inescapable consequence. The financial cleanup of their massive mess was swift and incredibly satisfying. The initial $300,000 that I had generously allocated for what I truly believed was a beautiful wedding celebration had been completely recovered. Horizon Properties refunded the entire venue deposit directly back to my primary business accounts, and the premium vendors returned the unused capital once the fraud was officially exposed to the public. I did not absorb that returned money back into my corporate portfolio. I decided to repurpose it entirely. I transferred the entire $300,000 wedding fund to a highly respected national legal charity that specializes entirely in fighting elder financial abuse. It is an aggressive organization dedicated to providing free legal representation for senior citizens who have been maliciously manipulated, coerced, or stolen from by their own greedy family members. I ensured that the money Madison tried to use to celebrate her deceptive triumph would instead be weaponized to actively hunt down financial predators, exactly like her and her disgraced husband. It felt like a profound, fittingly poetic justice to use their extravagant wedding budget to passionately protect vulnerable people from the exact nightmare I had barely escaped. My empire is now significantly stronger and much more secure than it has ever been in 40 years of business. I have implemented draconian oversight protocols and officially elevated Garrison to the permanent position of Chief Security Officer for the entire corporate network. Victor and I have successfully restructured my personal estate to guarantee that absolutely no one can ever attempt to bypass my authority again. I have learned to value profound loyalty over blind allegiance. The men standing beside me today earned their places through fire. My eyes are open. I wake up early every single morning, I drink my dark coffee, and I go directly to work with a clinical, unyielding focus. I do not miss the comforting illusion of the family I mistakenly thought I had. I strongly prefer the harsh, illuminated truth over a comfortable, dangerous lie. If you are currently listening to this story, I desperately need you to understand a very harsh reality about wealth, family, and the dark corners of human nature. We eagerly spend our entire lives working to build a safe fortress. We willingly sacrifice our sleep, our peace, and our precious youth to accumulate hard assets that will ultimately protect the people we love. We want to provide our children with a wonderful life completely free from the bitter struggles we endured. But in doing so, we often blindly ignore the very real possibility that the absolute worst predators are not always lurking outside the heavy iron gates. Sometimes you have unknowingly raised the ultimate predator inside your own home. You must never let blood ties blind you to suspicious, highly deceptive behavior. You must never ignore your own powerful intuition just to maintain a superficial, toxic family peace. When a close family member suddenly changes their behavior, when they start asking highly inappropriate questions about your private finances, or when they try to aggressively isolate you from your trusted advisors, you must recognize the imminent threat immediately. Do not make gentle excuses for them. Do not foolishly assume they have your best interests at heart. Verify absolutely everything. Protect your hard-earned assets with ironclad legal structures. Trust your gut instinct above all else. Because if you stubbornly refuse to see the truth, they will gladly smile directly in your face while they silently dig your shallow grave. When the people you built a fortress for try to lock you out, you do not knock on the door. You burn the fortress to the ground and build a new one.